You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Hey everyone, it's Paige, your favorite nutrition podcaster and dietitian. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. This podcast relies on the support of listeners like you and needs donations to keep this project running. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at pagesmothersrd.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click Reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at Paige Smathers RD if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hey everyone, this is Paige Smathers, your host, and I'm excited to share with you another episode that I recorded a long time ago that's been sort of a hit among my longtime listeners. And this is a conversation that I had with a local professor at the University of Utah who does a lot of research in the field of nutrition. And we talked all about fat. Fat is kind of a popular topic and one that's been evolving throughout the years. And we're talking in this episode all about sort of what the current research says about fat as a macronutrient. So I'm really excited to share this with you because it's so important to me and so exciting to me to help people have less fear around food. And one of the things that, if you lived through the 90s, you likely absorbed a lot of fear around that macronutrient. So this episode is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. And before we get into it, I always like to just make sure that all of my listeners know about some resources available to them. So one is the Nutrition Matters Podcast community. That is a Facebook group that we talk about some of these episodes in more depth. It's a place where you can ask questions. It's a place where you can be a part of the conversation. I also am now taking on just a select few kind of long distance clients for one-on-one distance coaching. So if you're interested in that and you want to check out that service, go to my website, pagesmothersrd.com, and then click on individuals under services, and then scroll down about halfway. There's an online application for you to fill out just to see if we would be a good fit for long distance coaching. So if you're interested in that, check it out and fill out that application. And then, of course, my online course is another thing to check out as a resource if you're looking for kind of more practical, down-to-earth, sort of step-by-step processes for how to make healing your relationship with food happen in real life. Check out the online course. That's at pagesmothersrd.com/course. And one other thing that I want to mention is I am so excited to announce that I will be hosting an in-person workshop all about mindful eating in Salt Lake City in the spring. So details of that are kind of to be continued. But if you're interested in looking at the details, that will be available on my website as well. So this will be an in-person all-day workshop on a Saturday in spring. We're looking at a few different dates at this point. I'm teaming up with Noah Rasheta, who has been on the podcast. He's also the host of the Secular Buddhism podcast, and he is someone who his entire career is devoted to mindfulness. He's such a gifted, amazing teacher. I can't wait to team up with him and do an entire all-day training in how to kind of connect the principles of mindfulness into your relationship with food. So if you're interested in that, we're going to have some people flying out from different areas of the country. Cannot wait to hopefully see you there, and spots are limited. So just wanted to make sure to announce it. We're not nailed down quite yet with the details, but keep your eyes out for that. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram to kind of stay in the loop as well. So that's Paige Smathers RD on Instagram and also on Facebook as well. So with that, let's get into our conversation with Thunder Jalili, all about fat, which is such an evolving story, and I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation. Enjoy. So I will go ahead and read a little bit about him, and then we'll get into it. So Thunder Jalili received his PhD from The Ohio State University in nutrition with specialization in biochemistry and molecular biology. Following graduate school, Dr. Jalili completed postdoctoral fellowships at the Harvard School of Public Health in the Department of Cancer Biology and the University of Cincinnati Medical Center in the Division of Cardiology. He joined the faculty at the University of Utah in 1999 and is currently an associate professor in the Division of Nutrition with an adjunct appointment in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science. So, Dr. Jalili, do you want to say hello?
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here. So, anything else that we missed in the intro?
No, you covered the basics.
Okay, great. So, a name like Thunder, I just have to ask, is there a cool story about that?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not really a cool story. The only story behind it is my parents wanted a different kind of name, not anything normal, so that was the best they could come up with.
I love it. I've been telling my family who's here visiting this weekend. I've been telling them I'm going to interview someone named Thunder Jalili, and they're like, "Whoa!" They think it's so cool. So I love it. It's a great name.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's get into it. I want to sort of build a little bit of a foundation to understanding a little bit of the history about fat, because that's important as we talk about the current events in the fat debate and in the fat controversy. So let's just talk about the history of the diet-heart hypothesis and how this came to be. And maybe even before we talk about the diet-heart hypothesis, let's be sure to define what that is.
Sure. So the diet-heart hypothesis was really formalized in the 1950s by a physiologist named Ancel Keys, who was kind of a towering figure in nutrition and epidemiology. Ancel was actually the guy who kind of invented nutritional epidemiology in a way, because he's the one who started making associations with what people ate and outcomes. And in this case, he was interested in fat, and the outcome he was interested in was coronary artery disease.
And so Ancel Keys, the way I understand it, it was sort of a reaction to some of the things going on in the country at the time, where President Eisenhower was suffering from heart disease and heart attacks, and people were frantically trying to look for reasons behind his health, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't actually just Eisenhower. For a couple decades, the rates of coronary artery disease were really skyrocketing, and I guess it came to a head with Eisenhower's condition, because and I can't remember when it was, but it was sometime in the early 50s or mid 50s. When he was president, he did have a heart attack, and he was one of the early adopters of what Dr. Keys was preaching, and went on a low-fat diet, was very strict about what he ate, but it was before that. It was for a good, I would say, up to 20 years before that, where the rates of heart disease were really just going up.
Okay.
One of the interesting things about Eisenhower, back then, the and maybe we'll talk about this later too, but smoking was kind of an underappreciated and unknown risk factor for many things, including heart disease. People really didn't make a connection between smoking and heart disease. The most you heard about, back in the 1930s or 40s or 50s, was that, smoking is bad for the wind. So I guess if you're running track or something, you shouldn't smoke. But they didn't really understand the damage it does to blood vessels and how it lays the foundations of coronary artery disease. So getting back to Eisenhower, he was a very, very heavy smoker. I don't know if people know that. And he was famous, especially in World War II, when he was, Supreme Allied Commander and under, tremendous stress in, 1944 and 1945. He smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day.
Wow.
And yeah, it's shocking. And, there was stories about him, how His fingers were stained with nicotine. His teeth were stained. He constantly reeked of cigarettes. He always had a cigarette in his hand or in his mouth. And, when you smoke 80 cigarettes a day, I guess that's the way it is.
Right. Wow. Yeah. That I actually didn't know that either.
Yeah.
So that's
I think that went a long way into his heart disease.
Right. Right. That's a confounding factor for sure. So Ansel Keys kind of, just to kind of build on this foundation
Sure.
here. He started this diet heart hypothesis. So let's get into talking about what that really means.
So what he was observing was so I guess I should take a step back.
Okay.
There was this physiological observation that damaged arteries with disease had a waxy, fatty-like material that was building up in there. And looking at autopsies, physiologists could see this when they would, open up and dissect the vessel. They could see this fatty material in there. And this was, a lot of this too came from autopsies of Korean War casualty victims. A lot of times these were young men, in their teens or even early 20s. And so they made this observation. And then the question was, well, how does, fat get into the vessel? And it was just pretty much a logical deduction that, fat that we eat must be collecting in the vessels. And so that kind of laid the foundation for making these observations. And then Keys went on to collect dietary information from various countries and, and to try to make a connection between the fat that they eat and their rates of coronary artery disease. So he started doing this in the 50s, mostly kind of observational, small collections, and he visited different countries in Europe and around the Mediterranean, and he started collecting his results. And then in 1958, he, studied a formal large study called the 7-country study, which the idea was he's going to follow diets of these 7 countries and different regions in 7 countries for a period of time. And I think he followed it for something like 10 years. And then he used those observations to further advance his case that fat that is consumed in the diet is related to the amount of coronary artery disease and hence mortality.
Okay. Right. So that's the basic of the diet heart hypothesis, is just that the fat that we consume leads to fat in our arteries, which then leads to events such as heart attacks.
That's it in a nutshell.
Okay. Okay. And, I read the book Big Fat Surprise, and I know you read that too. Did you agree with her kind of thesis that, just on the Ansel Keys issue, that he was just a really, really powerful kind of charismatic figure, that then it sort of developed into this nutritional dogma that if you didn't agree with that diet heart hypothesis, it would be really difficult to get funding. And so it kind of led to not a lot of studies being done to look at other possibilities for consuming foods and then developing heart disease. Do you get a sense that that's true?
Well, since I wasn't around in that time period,
yeah, exactly.
and I don't really know what was going on kind of, on the ground, I have to take the author's word for it to some extent.
Right.
But it does kind of make sense from what I know now, being in research and, observing, the politics that sometimes surround research and that surround different hypotheses that are either favored or unfavored. So I can see that happening.
But yeah, you can't say, yes, that for sure happened. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I can't say it exactly happened like that. The author actually interviewed people, who were contemporaries of Keys and who were around at the time. So, she, I'm assuming she did a good job, putting together that background information. And I also have to believe, if you make a pretty strong impact in the public press, such as, Time Magazine and other popular literature of the day, you had to have been, something of a sensation and something of a strong personality. Because otherwise, it's hard to break out of the shell of science and get other people around you to notice you.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great perspective. Thank you. So, as we both know, there's some general issues with epidemiological studies as it relates to nutrition. It's tough to prove cause and effect by just asking someone what they eat on average over the last few years and then watching them throughout decades and seeing what kinds of chronic diseases they develop. It's tough to say, wow, this particular food causes this particular chronic disease. So,
Yeah.
so there's some issues there, and we don't need to dive into that, but it's just tough to prove cause and effect with nutrition. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Because epidemiology, you try to control for all these external variables that may be affecting the outcome that you're interested in, but it's tough because, you're doing this on free living people.
Right.
So there's always things that you didn't think about, or maybe you think you're controlling, but you're not really controlling. And, historically, well, I shouldn't say historically, traditionally, what we use epidemiology for, at least one thing that I like to use it for, is I use it to find associations that may be, that have a good potential of being valid, and then I try to kind of prove that, so to speak, using an experimental model, or using an interventional study. So that's really the strength in epidemiology. It helps you form a hypothesis for an intervention or experimental study.
To then do something more controlled. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah, exactly. But it doesn't prove cause and effect. Just tells us, look here.
Gives us an idea of where to start. And what's also tricky about that, those studies in the past is, nutrition is a really new science. We're always learning new things. And so when they were looking at saturated fat or cholesterol intake, they didn't even really know about trans fats at the time. And so it's tough to know what was really affecting what, right? Because they were only really looking at a couple variables, but food is very complex. There's a lot of ingredients and components to it. So anyway, just kind of, I just think it's interesting to sort of understand kind of why we are where we are currently with our stance on fat. And so if you could kind of take us to right now, 2015, end of 2015, what would you say kind of is the general buzz going on in maybe in the scientific world, but then also in the kind of layman's world too?
I would say right now the layperson is some number of years behind the evolving thinking of the scientific community, and here's what I mean by that. I think we're at a point now where pretty much most people in nutrition and, a portion of people in medicine in general are understanding that, maybe fat isn't this catastrophe that we thought it is, because there's been some, more sophisticated studies and some better analysis of previous studies, and it's pointing to the fact that it isn't such a clear-cut relationship between fat and heart disease. And so most people in science are evolving their thinking. Now, the contrast with the public is that they've had it, and I should include, me, you, everyone as a society, we've had it beat into our brains for the last 40 years that fat, is the spawn of Satan. So, we're behind the scientific thinking in general as a society, and it'll probably take a couple more years to catch up. And one interesting just add on to that is I teach a class with freshmen and sophomores at the University of Utah. People would know, they don't have a science background, they don't have a nutrition background, and they all still think, fat and cholesterol is the number one causes of heart disease.
And yeah, people are from my perspective and from my end of what I do, people are really scared of fat. They're really scared of it. It causes a lot of anxiety about what the heck to eat. And so that's kind of why I wanted to do this. So I'm really, really grateful to talk to you about all this. So just some current statistics. Current incidence of death rate due to heart-related issues in the United States is at 25% of all mortality causes. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Yeah, basically 25% of all deaths in the United States are due to some form of heart disease.
Okay, and then also I think it's really interesting to kind of note that with this other statistic that despite our society consuming on average about 30% of our total calories are coming from fat. 5 decades ago or so, we were consuming about 40% of our total calories were from fat. And now we've moved down to 30, and we're still at this really high rate of heart disease. And so, that's kind of causing some people a few years ago, before all this wave of new science about fat began, it caused some people to kind of think, well, why are we still having such a problem when we've successfully decreased our total calories from fat? So So with that, I want to hear a little bit about you and what you do. Do you study fat in particular, or what are your areas of study, just kind of briefly to kind of lay the groundwork there?
Okay. So I have studied fat a little bit on and off in my career. I haven't really done anything with fat in, I don't know, probably about three years, I would say. The last study I did with fat was an experimental study where we gave very high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets to a rat model, a strain of rat that develops hypertension as it ages, and then it develops cardiovascular complications because of hypertension. And we did a study where we gave them high-fat, low-carb diet, and their hypertension was relieved to some extent. Their blood pressure went down. And so that was the most recent thing with fat. But what I do now is not so much fat, but it's definitely in the realm of nutrition and heart disease. I'm interested in magnesium, the mineral, as it relates to vascular function and metabolism. And I'm also interested in studying the role of phytonutrients, phytochemicals, and how they can improve vessel function and improve blood pressure.
Oh, that's so cool. I love that. And I'm always telling people to have a respect for the fact that there are people just like you out there who are discovering, new things about nutrition every single day. So we can't act like we have it all figured out. That's still a lot to learn about food and nutrition and our bodies. So
yeah, and hard to apply it to people because, like you said, people are complex. We live, in a multi-variable state, so it's hard to do really precise studies on people.
Yeah, and I think so much of our reasons for eating or our diets or whatever are related to our relationship with food and our upbringing and our mentality and our mental health in general. So yeah, it's a tricky thing to study, but super interesting. So very cool. Okay, so do you feel like we've laid a good groundwork for kind of understanding the current state of where we are in this country as it relates to fat and our relationship, or would you add anything else?
I think so. There's just one other thing I would like to add, just to kind of complete the background with fat.
Sure.
You mentioned a couple minutes ago about how our fat intake as a nation was, say around 40% of calories, and now it's down to around 30% of calories. And our heart disease rates are still up, and that's totally true. Just to add a little bit more color to that, the types of fats we are eating now are really different than the types of fats we ate 50 years ago or 60 years ago. Couple particular changes. One is that we used to eat a lot more butter, say 60 years ago, and we don't now. And two, we eat a lot more shortening and manufactured fats now that we did not 60 years ago. So you don't just have a change in the amount of fat that we eat, we also have a change in the type of fat that we eat.
So would you say we can't clear cut say less saturated fat now, right? Because
yeah, I would say we probably eat less saturated fat now.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay.
It's just that like we eat more polyunsaturated fats than we used to, and part of that is coming from the amount of shortening
and processed foods.
Yeah, because that's where basically shortenings and manufactured fats are used. We always had like a little bit of processed fats in the American diet since like the turn of the last century, the 1900s. But the intake of those has really spiked up, beginning in the early 1950s, in the mid 1950s, and a lot of that initially was just huge amounts of trans fats. And now we have less trans fats, but it's only been something like 3 or 4 years that our trans fat intake is starting to drop a little bit. So who knows what the effect of that is going to be on disease. We need like another 20 years to see how it plays out. But we've had this big history, right? We've had this big history of like 40 years, 50 years of eating lots of trans fats.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah. And it's important for, everyone to also understand that back in the 50s and 60s, they would include, like, when Keyes and his contemporaries were doing this kind of research, epidemiology research, they would include trans fats and margarine and shortening in the animal fat group. So, the study that did make connections with animal fats, I mean, who knows if that was actually really the animal fats or they're really making a connection with trans fats or margarines.
Oh, yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I think in order to understand fat and to understand sort of where we are with heart health, we have to talk a little bit about carbohydrate as well. So
Sure.
Just for anyone who's listening who's kind of needs a little bit of a refresher on some basic nutrition, we have 3 macronutrients: carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Most food that we eat is going to contain some carbohydrate, maybe some fat, and maybe some protein. It's not very clear cut on this is only a carbohydrate or this is only a protein or this is only a fat. Most foods we eat are a combination of 2 or 3 of those things. So when we became really concerned with our overall fat intake, what the food industry did is then say, okay, well, if we're going to take fat out of our foods, we have to add something because fat-free foods just don't taste good. Butter, fat, oils, all of that helps to add flavor to our foods. So if you take out fat, you have to add sugar. And I think most people kind of are aware of this. If something's low fat, it's likely going to be higher in sugar. So along with talking about kind of trends in decreasing overall fat consumption, total calories, if you're going to decrease total consumption of fat, you're going to have to increase something, and chances are it wasn't protein. So as a result, Americans tended to eat more carbohydrate and sugar, and sugar is a carbohydrate. So overall, sugar intake is definitely on the rise. Do you have anything you want to kind of talk about or speak to specifically in regards to that?
Yeah, sure. So that was a really nice summary you provided. And a couple things to add to that is the processed food industry now has really been a big culprit, because if you're a manufacturer and you're like making something and you go in a box or in a can or so forth, carbohydrates are the easiest to manipulate for that. So we have a lot of sugar and a lot of refined carbohydrates that are added to products that make boxes and cans. So that you can kind of overlay. I don't know if anyone's done this scientifically, but you can overlay the rise in sugar consumption from, say, around 1900 up to today, and there's also a really big boom in processed foods in that same period. The other thing to add to the point that you made is we got on this low-fat kick in earnest as a nation, probably somewhere around like 1980. Give or take, a few years. And there's a really nice correlation between our sugar intake and when the low-fat message started to be really hammered in society. And the sugar intake has increased, fairly dramatically since about 1980. Where this will go in the future, I don't know, because maybe now the message is going to change a little bit. So will we have a drop in our sugar intake? I hope, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think there's definitely camps and schools of thought out there to try to help people decrease their sugar consumption, but I don't know if that's affecting positively throughout the entire population at this point. But.
Yeah, and it's a tough sell, isn't it? Because sugar is so cheap. High fructose corn syrup is like so dirt cheap because of the corn subsidy, and you can add it to anything, and it makes everything taste better. So we have it literally in all processed foods.
Right.
A really interesting statistic is in 1820, typical American.
Sorry, 1820? Is that what you said?
Yeah, 1820.
Okay.
I'm going back a long time.
Okay. I just want to make sure I heard you right.
Yeah, almost 200 years. But the average American consumed maybe somewhere around 8 pounds of sugar a year back then. 8 pounds of sugar sounds like a lot, okay? But fast forward, almost 200 years, and now the average American consumes over 100 pounds of sugar a year.
Wow.
That's dramatic.
So let's talk about that while we're on the subject. Where are we getting our sugar? I think some people are really just out of touch with where their sugar is coming from.
Yeah, it's the thing with sugar is, again, we go back to our processed foods that are so prevalent in the grocery stores. These are a big source of sugar, and obviously there's a few processed foods that have really concentrated doses of sugar. Like we all know the soda pop has a lot of sugar, and any kind of dessert type food, whether it's ice cream or cakes or cookies, or chocolates, of course, they have a lot of sugar. So we can point the finger at those pretty easily and say, yeah, those have a lot of sugar. But there's also so many other foods that have little bits of sugar in them, processed foods, that is. And, we just end up consuming, all these foods here and there and not thinking about it, and then they add up. And I'll just throw out a few products, just to think about. Yogurt. Any kind of yogurt that's not plain yogurt, or any kind of yogurt that's low-fat or non-fat yogurt has a lot of sugar. If you have yogurt that's plain and has fat, there's just less sugar in it. Any kind of fruit juice, any kind of fruit-based snack, typically will have a lot of sugar. So those things we consume kind of a lot of.
Right.
And
so
then,
I think sometimes people think,
too.
Okay, condiments. Yeah, sorry. I'll let you continue.
Well, I just wanted to mention, condiments like ketchup is a source of sugar. And someone once said, like, an American can eat anything with 2 slices of bread and ketchup.
Yes. So I think some people will kind of be like, okay, why are we talking about sugar when we're sort of trying to talk about fat? So how can we bring that back? Does, in your opinion, or in your research, or in your knowledge, does sugar relate to heart disease?
Yeah. And so here's how I circle back around to sugar. If for decades we're taught that we shouldn't eat fat, okay, then we have to, have foods that are low in fat but yet taste good. And so enter the processed food manufacturers, and they put sugar in the foods that they produce because they don't want to have too much fat in it. So we have to talk about sugar, because as we cut out the one nutrient, we end up getting the other nutrient in processed foods. Now, if you're the kind of person that doesn't eat processed foods and you only eat whole foods, then, you're not affected quite as much. But you're still affected to some degree, because you're making now food choices that are based on fat content. So you're more apt to choose a higher carbohydrate food because it does not have fat. So that's how I think sugar is the other half of the story. And it's kind of a two-pronged issue. So the sugar can kind of increase vascular inflammation in 2 ways. Okay, one is, like, if you have someone who is diabetic or someone who has metabolic syndrome, and they have high blood glucose levels, okay, that high blood glucose can trigger some inflammation. So that's kind of a direct and easy way of, like, connecting sugar and inflammation, okay?
Right.
The second way, and this is a little more difficult, a little more obtuse, but when an individual eats a lot of sugar, that sugar is actually converted, and I should say not just sugar, but also a lot of carbohydrates, like refined carbohydrates or any kind of carbohydrate that's more pure in source. That carbohydrate can be converted into fat and triglycerides in the liver, and then that subsequently is shipped out into the bloodstream. And then having a lot of fat in the bloodstream can also increase inflammation. And that inflammation did not originate because we ate fat and we got fat in the bloodstream. It originated because we ate a high carbohydrate diet that got converted into fat and then entered the bloodstream. So I hope that makes sense.
No, that does. That's great. Okay, so that's why we're talking about sugar. It's part of the equation. It's important to understand fat by because they really do give and take, right? If you're eating less fat, you're going to be eating more sugar, and it's important to understand that dynamic relationship. So
Yeah.
I want to talk about some specifics here. So first of all, let's just talk about cholesterol. So dietary cholesterol. I get kind of surprised when I still hear people say, my doctor told me not to eat eggs anymore. My doctor told me not to do this or this or this anymore, food wise. No more cheese because I have high cholesterol. Can you speak briefly about that?
Yeah. So dietary cholesterol in humans does not really have much of an impact on blood lipoprotein levels. And so when we talk about cholesterol in the blood, really we're talking about lipoproteins, which are these carriers of fat and cholesterol in the
And
blood.
and so people know them as good cholesterol and bad cholesterol
Yeah,
in general,
yeah,
right? Okay.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And the bottom line is dietary cholesterol really does not impact your levels of good or bad cholesterol that much. So that advice is not really helpful. Food like you brought up cheese as an example. Cutting down on cheese, it may have a effect on your blood lipoprotein levels, like on your good cholesterol and bad cholesterol levels, but it's not really a detrimental effect because, like the epidemiology, with cheese shows that cheese has, a neutral effect, potentially even a slightly beneficial effect to reducing cardiovascular disease-based mortality. So that advice of like don't eat cheese, there's no actual epi data to strongly support that.
Right. Yeah. And that's going to be shocking to a lot of people. So a lot of people are like, okay, I can't have full fat milk. I can't have
Hmm.
cheese in my diet. I can't eat eggs. And that's a really important message for people to hear that is part of that diet heart hypothesis from way back when in history that we kind of started with. That's been
Yeah,
proven time and time again to not really have that strong of a correlation there or make it that big of a difference with that total cholesterol, even
yeah,
LDL and HDL.
yeah. Well, yeah, and the studies that have shown that like dairy and like high fat, high saturated fat can raise your blood cholesterol levels. There's studies that show that, and it's true, but it's kind of raising everything. So it's not just raising your bad cholesterol, so to speak. It's also raising your good cholesterol. So the balance between the two is still going to be okay, and in some cases the balance may even be better because the good cholesterol goes up more. And there's another layer of of complexity to that. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but it's about the lipoprotein particle size too. That could be an important factor
Well,
as well.
I think that's really interesting. So if you can, yeah, if you have time to talk about that, I think that would be great.
Yeah. So what I mean by the lipoprotein particle size is that if you think of like bad cholesterol, it's the commonly used term. So it
Which I
really
don't
refers
love the
to
words good and bad, but we'll just go.
yeah,
Just it makes people so
I
scared and
know.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't like them either, but it's let's just use them right now because
Right,
it's
because
the term
it's
that people
what
know.
people understand
Yeah.
exactly.
But the way I teach this in my class is I tell people, look, you can't put fat and cholesterol in the blood and have it circulate through the body because it's, like an oil. It's a fat. It does not mix with water, which is what your blood is. And everybody knows this because everyone has tried to mix like vinegar and olive oil for salad dressing or something, and it doesn't stay together.
Exactly.
So yeah, so we have to figure out a way to transport fat in the bloodstream, and we do that by making these lipoproteins that are kind of like little delivery trucks, and they can interact fine with the blood, and we stuff the inside of them with fat and cholesterol. So just think of a lipoprotein that way. So there's the issue of LDL, which is the bad cholesterol. The issue of LDL comes into you can have, say, 10 delivery trucks carrying, 10 pounds of cargo in each one, or you can have one delivery truck carrying 100 pounds of cargo. If I'm just measuring the weight of the cargo, I got 100 pounds either way, right? But if I look at the number of particles, the number of delivery trucks, I have more if I have 10 trucks, each carrying 10 pounds. Now, this actually has relevance to heart disease because it may be the number of LDL particles, in other words, the number of bad cholesterol particles that's really important, not necessarily the amount of LDL cholesterol. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to visualize it with the trucks. So to translate to that to people kind of checking out their LDL and HDL and total cholesterol levels, you can't look at those numbers and know, do I have small particles or do I have large particles, right? So that's what you're saying. Exactly. Is you can't just look at that number and know if you're really at risk or not. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yeah. And the same that, even I am a little, confused on this, and I'm not really sure how it plays out, but when you see that, say, a certain dietary pattern, like high-fat dairy or something, will increase cholesterol levels a little bit. So what I don't know is, and I'm sure somebody knows this, but I haven't, gotten a clear answer. Is this going to be increasing your total cholesterol level? So we're not increasing the number of trucks, we're just increasing a little bit how much each truck carries, or maybe we're reducing the number of trucks and we're just increasing the cargo of each one. So when we look at the total cargo, amount, we see maybe a little bit more. But maybe that, maybe the number of trucks hasn't increased, or it could even go down. And that can have a pretty large impact on disease risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm confused on this too.
Yeah. And, that's a test that we can't get. Like when I go to my doctor for my annual checkup, which everybody should do, so I'll put in a plug for that, public health. But, when I do that and I get my cholesterol reading, I don't know how many LDL particles I have. It doesn't say that on the test. It just gives a total amount. And you look at the test, and everyone's, most people have a blood test at some point. You look and it says LDL, say, 120 milligrams per deciliter. Well, what that number means, milligrams is a unit of mass. It's a weight. Deciliter is a unit of volume. So you're seeing what is the mass of cholesterol you have in like 1 deciliter. That doesn't tell you anything if that mass is spread out over, a few hundred particles or thousands of particles. And the reality is when particles are really small, when LDL is really small, it actually is better at getting into the walls of blood vessels and causing atherosclerosis and blockage of the arteries.
Right. So if there's a way to know that you had small particle size, there would be reason to be concerned about your risk for heart disease.
Yeah. So what I, would love to do is, change my diet and be able to track maybe not just the amount of cholesterol, but the particle size as well. I think that would be informative.
Oh, that would be awesome. And I hate to press this, but I know that this is really confusing for a lot of people. So if someone's listening to this and they're like, yeah, I just got my numbers back and my total cholesterol was, 230 and I had, too high of LDL, but my HDL was just fine. Well, I mean, I know we don't want to provide like nutrition advice for any specific person, but just in general, like how should that person kind of digest this information?
Yeah, maybe the easiest way to try to reconcile it is to take a ratio of your LDL to your HDL, or take a ratio of your total cholesterol to your HDL. There is a lot of data that shows relative risk of mortality or cardiovascular events based on this ratio.
Okay.
And even based on the total amount of LDL. And for sure there's a relationship, there is a higher risk of events and mortality if someone has a total cholesterol like 240. But the risk is not 100%. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you have someone who has an LDL of like 100, there is a lower risk of cardiovascular mortality, but the risk isn't zero. And because that's where the differences in LDL particle size could be, having an effect. there's lots of people that have heart attacks who have normal cholesterol levels. Why is that? How is that possible? Well, some of that may be this mystery of the LDL particle size exerting an effect, because you have a low total mass being transported, but the number of particles is great.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's great. So there's more to learn and more to discover, and hopefully more tests that physicians can provide for people to be able to understand their risk.
Yeah, it would be nice if at some point in the future we could get that information as well. For now, just use the ratio and recognize there's relatively higher risk, but it doesn't mean 100% risk if you're over 4.5 of total cholesterol to HDL ratio.
And do what you can in the other ways that can contribute to heart disease, right? So be active and eat lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and take care of yourself mentally and sleep well and drink enough water, blah blah blah, all that stuff.
all that stuff. Because there's really not just one thing that causes everything or saves you from everything.
Right.
It's a compilation of things.
Exactly. Okay. So let's just quickly talk about trans fat. We've mentioned this. Let's just help people understand what this term means.
Sure. So this is most of the trans fats we eat in our diet are manufactured trans fats. There are some naturally occurring trans fats in dairy, for example, but the amounts are small, and those trans fats don't really have any kind of negative effect that I'm aware of. The major trans fats that are atherogenic, that cause vessel problems, are the manufactured ones. And so basically it comes down to this. These are an inexpensive source of solid fats, and they have a long shelf life. So they got a lot of popularity for those reasons. Going back, I'm trying to think when Crisco was invented. It was probably like back in the 1930s or something. But maybe you could look it up and find out the exact date.
I will look it up.
But it was basically just you take oil and like liquid oil that has a lot of polyunsaturated fat, meaning that this is fat with several double bonds in its chemical structure. And this fat is really unorganized and, kind of in disarray. So it doesn't arrange itself in any kind of neat fashion at a molecular level. So that's why we have kind of an oil. And then when you make a trans fat, you put pressure on it, you put a catalyst in there, you bubble in hydrogen, and you convert some of those double bonds into a single bond that holds carbons together. And that straightens out the chemical structure of the fatty acid. And those straighter fatty acids can now organize themselves better, and they tend to stack on top of each other, kind of like a deck of playing cards. And so now you don't have an unorganized mass of fatty acids. You have an organized, stacked group of fats, and that ends up being solid. So because they're stacked together, their molecular arrangement is solid, and we can see it and feel it, that it's solid. So we can, through chemistry, we convert polyunsaturated fats into more saturated fats, and those saturated fats are called trans. And I won't get into the chemistry of why they're a trans, but basically they're trans. And
that
so
was
now,
1911 by Procter and Gamble.
All right, 1911, a little earlier than I thought, and people didn't really like it. It took a while for that to really gain favor, because everyone liked to use like lard back then. And maybe we should still use lard.
Right. Yeah. So interesting to kind of.
Yeah. Lard is 50% olive oil, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Like look up the composition of lard. It's like half of it, almost 50% of it is monounsaturated fat.
And so monounsaturated fat would be olive oil.
That's the main source in our diet. I mean, we mostly eat olive oil, and it's in other foods, like it's in nuts. I mean, we don't call it olive oil, and it's in nuts. It's oleic acid is the main form, and it's in some other foods.
Okay. And then the other type of fat would be polyunsaturated fat, which you've already mentioned a few times.
So just the trans fat, I guess the one connecting the dot I didn't make at the end that I should have is the trans fats. They're a little more like saturated fats, because they stack up and they're solid. But the thing is, they are really bad in terms of raising our LDL levels in our blood. And not only do they raise LDL levels, they also lower HDL, which, remember, that's the good cholesterol that people know of. So that's, a bad effect to lower.
So that's
HDL.
going to wreak havoc on those numbers and that ratio that you mentioned.
Balance,
Exactly.
And one more thing, kind of like to kick you when you're down, the particle size of LDL also tend to be smaller with a lot of trans fat in the diet.
Okay, so with all that evidence, that's why trans fats are now being required to be on the label. But just for consumer awareness, it's only required to be on it if it's greater than 0.5 grams per serving on the label. So there technically could be trans fats in some of the processed packaged foods that we're eating, and we might just not know it because it's not required by law to be on the food label.
Absolutely.
So that's when we come back to really recommending, those whole foods, one ingredient, exactly what's in it, fresh, not necessarily fresh, could be, whatever, but just whole natural foods.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So I know I want to be really sensitive to your time. I know we've had a long, great conversation so far.
From a physiological standpoint, to make fat, you must have insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's released after we eat carbohydrates. And insulin turns on the enzymes and the metabolic systems that generate free fatty acids. If you don't have insulin, then you can't really make fat. So fat by itself can't really make you fat. If you just ate 100% fat, you wouldn't be able to make fat. You'd use some of that fat for energy, and if there's extra left over, maybe you could store it, but you really wouldn't be great at generating fat because you're missing insulin.
So because you'd lack the carbohydrate, which causes the insulin release. Exactly. Yeah. But it's definitely not as simple as we thought in the past, in the 80s and 90s that you were talking about, where we were saying, okay, everyone eat a low-fat diet to help you not gain weight and to help you not have heart disease. That was a little bit oversimplified.
Yeah, that's totally oversimplified, and that's not the case.
And you know what I think is kind of interesting? I think I had this epiphany a few months ago. We don't binge on fat by itself, right? We don't just go like chug olive oil or like go eat 5 avocados or, it's tough. It's tough to eat too much fat like on its own. The only time we really go crazy on fat is when it's combined with some type of carbohydrate, right? So,
exactly.
So like a milkshake. Obviously, there's a lot of fat in a milkshake, but there's also a lot of sugar, right? So I think that's something to kind of think about. Exactly. Yeah. So,
that's totally true. So that makes it even harder because, go with your milkshake or ice cream example. Like you pick it up, you're like, oh man, there's 25 grams of fat in this Grater's ice cream. So I know if I eat one of these every day, I'm going to get fat. But there's also 25 grams of sugar.
Right.
We just kind of ignore the sugar and focus on the fat.
And it's a bummer that we call it fat and fat, right? That it's the same word for two very different things. And that's an important distinction to make. Yeah,
it is an important distinction. And that words make a difference, because they color our judgment and give us some preconceived notions.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, one more lightning round question. Sure. And I'm going to combine 2 in 1. So saturated fat is another kind of difficult thing to understand and wade through all the new information. So tell me what you would say about saturated fat consumption as it relates to heart disease, as well as kind of combining red meat in there, because we all know that red meat is high in saturated fat.
Okay. So in general with saturated fat, the evidence that saturated fat from the diet causes cardiovascular events and cardiovascular mortality. That evidence is not a slam dunk. There are studies that show more cardiovascular events, like disease events, with a high saturated fat diet, but the mortality part of it is oftentimes missing. So in other words, there's not any greater mortality. So it's more complex than we thought. Red meat is really interesting because, I grew up in the period of time, like when I was in high school and college where everyone said, red meat causes heart attacks, so much fat and cholesterol in red meat and this and that. And, maybe there was some truth to that. There are some studies that indicate red meat does increase your relative risk for cardiovascular mortality. But it's probably not the fat in the meat that's doing it. Maybe it's other things. And that's, I guess, a subject of a whole other podcast of what the other things could be. So the bottom line with red meat is there is some evidence that red meat could increase your risk for events or mortality, but the evidence is on the weaker side. The part of red meat that has stronger evidence is processed red meat. Things like, pepperoni and lunch meat and Slim Jims and that segment of red meat, the processed. There is a stronger relationship between eating those and having increased risk for CVD mortality. But it's not related to fat. It's probably due to other things.
And that's where it comes in again, where we're still learning about more about nutrition and about what's actually in our foods so that we can know what to actually look for. Yeah.
And when it comes to, exactly. And a whole nother kind of area is how your intestines, handle these foods and what role the bacteria in your intestines and your colon has to play with processing the foods and making metabolites that could influence your biological system. So it's way more complex. I think we went through like decades of like studying the nutrients, not really thinking, what's the role of the other, universe of organisms that live inside of us. And that has a pretty strong role too.
Yeah. So I might have been a little bit over my head when I said, let's just talk about fat in just 1 hour. But I'm hoping that we can scratch the surface and tie it all up in the end and say, okay, here with all this background and with all the current things going on and with all this knowledge about sugar and fat, what should people do? Like practically, how do we apply what we've been talking about today? And I know that's a big, huge question, but just sum it up as best as you can do.
So I think the best way to practically apply it is to have a general rule of thumb that if it's a natural, unprocessed food product, don't worry that much about the fat content of that food. So if it's, let's pick on yogurt as an example. If it's yogurt you want to eat, don't worry if it's full-fat yogurt or 2% yogurt. The thing we should look out for is if it's flavored yogurt, that, is probably worse as an example. Because I would put flavored yogurt in the processed food side, but plain yogurt in the unprocessed side. So just have that be your guiding principle.
Let me add to that too. I think that there's a big difference. If you're sitting down to eat full-fat plain yogurt with no sugar added, you're going to kind of maybe be like, ooh, this could use a little honey or something, but it tastes pretty dang good. Now, if you're eating non-fat yogurt but sweetened, it's kind of, I don't know, it's not filling, it's not all that satisfying, you kind of want more. So I think there's a big difference when you do start allowing yourself to have more fat in your diet. You just feel better. You don't tend to have the crazy cravings and the ups and downs with hunger and fullness and all of that quite as much.
I think you also lose your taste of sugar because, like the yogurt, you brought up is we keep picking on yogurt, but it's an example I think everyone can relate to because we've all tried like a million different brands of yogurt. But,
right.
Like a flavored yogurt, like Yoplait strawberry. All right, that just is sweet. It just tastes like sugary sweet. When you have plain, full-fat yogurt, the taste is actually very creamy. It's mild and it's creamy. I mean, who doesn't like cream? So it's a completely different taste and flavor. And when I take that plain yogurt and I take out all the fat and I buy non-fat plain yogurt, I'll be honest, it's not really that good. It's much sharper in flavor and it loses all of its creaminess.
Totally. It's almost inedible. If there's no sugar and no fat, that's not going to
Yeah,
happen. Total.
yeah,
And you said, so try to eat when a fat is coming in a whole or a natural form, don't worry too much about it. I would say the same about sugar, right? So
yeah,
whole natural forms of sugar, go for it. Have your fruit. Don't be afraid of sugar after this conversation. Don't be afraid of fat either. Don't be afraid of food in general. But if there's improvements you can make, it would be to try to decrease that prepackaged, shelf-stable food that we tend to do too much of, and try to eat more whole, natural foods in their whole form.
yeah. I think that's the best take-home advice. Just avoid if it comes in a box or some sort of bag or process. That's the stuff we should try to eat less of and avoid.
Right, right.
You
And you
know,
know what? If you find yourself doing that occasionally, I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. I eat some of those things. But I
yeah,
focus on the whole foods. And I think it's
yeah,
unrealistic to take away from this, well, now I can't ever eat that ever again. That's not what we're trying to say. We're just trying to say wherever you are, try to make an improvement in the right direction. And we're trying to kind of
yeah,
give you an idea of kind of where you're headed.
yeah. And we don't want to confuse the foundation of your diet with this concept of exclusivity. I want to make the foundation of my diet unprocessed foods, but I'm not exclusively eating unprocessed foods. That's an important distinction.
Oh, that's a really great way to say that. That's really, really important because that does get very confusing and very discouraging for people who have that black and white mentality of, okay,
Hmm.
well, they told me eat whole foods and today I had a Snickers bar, so might as well just eat a whole gallon of ice cream now, right? I mean, there really is
Yeah,
that mentality
it's
out there.
over.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. And the thing is, we, in nutrition, we're always kind of harping this message, and I guess people have to, and the public have to understand where we're coming from, because we see a lot of people where the foundation of their diet is processed foods and is fast foods. So we're trying to affect a change in that population. If they could just go to what we were talking about, that would pay tremendous dividends, and not just their personal health, but our public health in our nation, our healthcare costs, and everything.
absolutely. But then there are people out there who are trying their very best and just very, very sensitive to these
Yeah,
messages. And then they take it and they're so type A and so perfectionist that they take it to the point where they're like, okay, I need to be perfect at this. Whereas they didn't
yeah,
understand that the audience that was intended was, the
yeah,
person who's just never eating something that came out of the ground, right? So,
yeah, yeah. And there are people like that, and those are really the ones we're trying to reach out to. And we as long as we just focus on that foundation, but not exclusive, just that's a good guiding principle.
all right. I love that. That's a great way to tie it up. Would you have anything else to add, or do you feel like we've done a good job scratching the surface?
Yeah, I think we've done a good job, and we've scratched the surface in some places, but I think we've also gone in depth in others. So I hope this has been a useful podcast for people, and also it kind of opens an individual's eyes for them to try to learn more on their own, because really we want people to get to the point where they can also educate themselves and they kind of know what to look for.
Exactly. And just to be introduced to this idea that, oh, maybe I can have higher fat yogurt. Just those little tiny takeaways can be really super helpful for people. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for giving us your time today and for all of your amazing knowledge. It's been so helpful and really, really interesting. So I really appreciate it.
you're welcome. It was a fun hour, and I also appreciate some of the things I learned from you. So thank you.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.